Since the 2014 elections, where the BJP party won a majority unprecedented, and with the appointment of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, India has now become the center of attention and admiration by the world. Mr. Modi's travels to foreign countries and meeting different leaders with such great diversity, from Mrs. Angela Merkel to the President of France, to President Obama, to Japan's Prime Minister, to Chinese Prime Minister and Premier. The diversity of leaders who all have suddenly become enthusiastic. Probably there is no better ambassador of India than the Prime Minister himself. As we have watched his travels, two things have emerged right away. First one is the pragmatic style. In other words, it is not an ideology-driven missions, but what can these countries do for India and what can India do to them? And the tireless energy just stands out. This lecture is all about future of India. I've given a title, India in 10 years, Imagining the Future. 10 years really is India in 2025. I was even debating, and the original writing that I did was India in 2025, but it sounds too far out. One of the key conclusions we will draw at the end of this analysis is that what India will need to continue its journey would be the continuity of political leadership. It is very important that India does not change its political agenda, manages both the domestic policy and its international policy, foreign affairs, with a steady hand and in a predictable manner. One of the key issues with any nation is lack of stability, unpredictability, uncertainty, which stops everybody, stops the ordinary people from making household decisions, to large corporations making investment decisions, to, in fact, non-profit social organizations getting totally paralyzed about what the intent is of the government. So continuity and predictability are very key essentials for the economic future and the growth of a nation. So let's start the journey. India's second independence, as people have called, really happened in 1991. While India became India's political freedom is more than 65 years old, its economic freedom is only less than 25 years old. In 1991, out of necessity, the government abandoned the planned social economy model on which the independent nation was founded. We call it License Raj as a nickname, in favor of more capitalistic, market-oriented economy, which changed the whole notion of the old policy of Lenin called commanding heights, which is a socialistic model to say key strategic industries should never be privatized. State-owned enterprises is the only way to manage, and the government should actually be in the business of income redistribution, which means tax the rich people, and however you collect the tax revenues, distribute to the poor people in terms of subsidies or what we call public assistance programs or welfare. Invest into certain educational sectors like medicine and engineering. So it was a model based around what is called the socialistic pattern of society, which might have worked very well, but unfortunately, since 1941 to 1991, India began to become a stagnant nation. It had a great potential, as it had historically had a great potential. It was one of the largest trading partners all the way to the 14th, 15th century. China and India were the two great trading nations in the world for their commodities and sometimes finished products. So India's second independence is its economic independence. I began to analyze the impact it made on the nation. Just like in China, in less than 35 years, China became from a communist, highly poor, almost a feudal society to becoming a major economic superpower, becoming number 2 in economy, surpassing Japan, Germany, France, United Kingdom, and is destined to become number 1 economy in GDP by 2025. So you begin to wonder, with all of the issues China has, the communist legacy, no financial or legal system which is comparable to the Western world. Capitalism still was not known or understood by the nation. The basics of doing business, because it was all government owned, government managed economy. If China can make that transformation in a way which has surprised the world, I think India can surprise even more. So let's look at what we have done since 1991. India is now one of the fastest growing economies in the world, 7 to 8% growth. So from the traditional Hindu rate of growth, as we call jokingly 2%, it has suddenly begun to get a spark. And the growth probably today is the highest in the world, surpassing the growth of China, not the base of economy, but the growth rate is a little better than China, which is beginning to plateau at about 7%. It has accumulated more than $400 billion of foreign reserves, where in 1991 it had no foreign reserves to pay for its imports, and hence the economic necessity to reform the economy. It is again spectacular growth, of course nowhere near the size of what China has accomplished, which is 1 decade more, namely that about $5 trillion of reserves. Its stock market India's stock market has generated wealth not only for a few entrepreneurs and business family owners, but also for the ordinary person. Through the mutual funds, people began to invest away from gold, away from bank accounts for fixed deposits, into the stock market, and therefore through mutual funds primarily, and therefore they have made more wealth themselves through the equity market. Several large new enterprises sprung out of nowhere. Reliance, the largest Indian enterprise, just was not there before 1991. Infosys came out of nowhere. Bharti Airtel, and these are pretty large corporations. Some primarily focused on the domestic economy, some already globally integrated. It has re-energized the traditional businesses. Tata, Aditya Birla Group, for example, Mahindra. Think about what they looked like before 1991 economic reforms, and since that time what has happened. Tata has become very large enterprise, globally involved, making some significant acquisitions all over the world, and substantially raising its market valuation. Especially one of the Tata companies, TCS, Tata Consultancy Services, came out of nowhere. As they began to list on the stock market, today it is number 2 in market valuation, right after IBM, surpassed the valuation of even Accenture and other bigger players. And the last point I wanted to make about impressive record is that India has been steadily getting globally integrated both economically and politically. Today, world news wants to talk about India, India's leadership, India's potential, India's talent, which is very interesting. So what has this done to the country? This impressive transformation of the nation out of sheer necessity, has had some intangible benefits, which I think is really important for us to understand and articulate. The first major change is India's self-confidence. People have new self-confidence. It's a can-do attitude, rather than having this defeatist view that, my God, I cannot do anything without government approval. I don't seem to have breathing space. I have the entrepreneurial capability, but I'm not able to exercise my capability in my own nation. The brain drain that happened since the independence, essentially, but definitely in the 70s and the 80s that took place, the brain drain was a major, major issue. Today, people are saying, I can do anything in India if I wanted to. It all matters is my own willpower and the freedom that I have. I'm talking about the economic freedom primarily. Interestingly, India has a new global image. I remember traveling in the 60s all over the world, and when people identified I'm of Indian origin, they would basically think about India as a country of roaming cows and snake charmers. I remember doing a machine tool industry project where people were laughing at me, saying that how can India be a heavy engineering machine tool industry producer? You must be faking it. You must be having some sort of a counterfeit or labeling problems, etc. Because they never thought India would be so good in engineering. It was, but we never thought about that one. Today when I travel and when people realize I'm of Indian origin, they admire, they smile. They don't think I'm there to settle in their country. Isn't that interesting? In fact, quite often, the difference is so sharp. In the early days, when I would come back to the American immigration customs people, they would always ask two questions. How long have you been away from the country and what do you do? These are screening questions. Often they never used to ask me that question. They say, are you a diamond merchant? Think about that. Today they say, are you a software engineer? Isn't that interesting? Complete change. So the new global image, where India has become a nation admired by others, I think is a significant intangible benefit we have got through those massive economic reforms. Third, and equally important, is there are global aspirations of Indian enterprises. Think about in the 80s, would anybody would have thought possible that a company called Mittal Steel will become the largest steel maker in the world, not just in India, but in the world. Nobody would have thought about that Tata Tea will be number 2 in the tea business right next to Unilever. Nobody would have thought about, in fact, that Aditya Birla Group will become a dominant player in the aluminum industry. Most of these through acquisitions. And Mahindra is dominating the small tractor business both in China, in India, as well as in America. These are all unimagined, unthinkable realities. So India can do it. It's very possible. It seems to have certain advantages which we will analyze. So the global aspiration of Indian enterprises has been another intangible benefit which during License Raj was not allowed. The next one is the most transformative. Out of nowhere, the traditional generation succession planning about family values, about economics, about earning, living, etc. has changed dramatically. The new generation of modern young couples, I call it the call center couple, actually are fueling the economy. They want a contemporary lifestyle, unlike their parents. There's a huge generation discontinuity. As I've said in other forums, the generation gap in India is under 8 years probably. The older sister cannot relate to the younger sister, not only in lifestyle but in values. But that new middle class is the key, actually, foundation for the growth of India. This young generation does not know how to cook clean. So everything they do is outsourced, eating out, bringing foods in, which is fascinating. That's creating services growth. The call center couple does not want to live with their parents. They would like their independence and freedom, which means they are the first time buyers as new household formation for everything, not just cell phones, not just consumer electronics, not just a motor bicycle or scooter or automobiles, but for eventually housing, eventually for everything. And just think about a typical new household formation. It is as massive a change with more numbers than what US economy went through, let's say, turn of the last century essentially, where it began to create a new middle class, and this new middle class wants to buy branded products. They don't want to shop in the neighborhood grocery store who had a traditional multi-generational relationship. A delivery boy will come and deliver, in fact, the daily necessities, the vegetables, the grains or whatever they did, had an account, a credit system. Sometimes the merchant will finance the family, middle class or lower, if they're struggling for paycheck. They say, all right, we will delay payment by 10 days, 15 days, whatever it is. Credit essentially in that kind. That's gone. The young generation would like to shop only branded products. So they would like to have branded rice, branded wheat, branded eggs, branded anything. They would like to have packaged and pre-ready, pretty prepared foods, and everything else in the same way. Also, in fact, they would like to shop at a modern supermarket. And they would like to have a credit card as a payment system. This is radically different than the way previous economy was there. I think this change is very massive, as we will touch upon that later on. The cell phone revolution that took place as a consequence of the 1991 economic reforms, allowing the private sector to be in the telephone business, which led to companies like Bharti Airtel, Idea is another company that came out, Tata's went into this business, etc., has revolutionized not only the industry, but the whole economy and the population. Talk about really flattening the world between the rural and urban, between illiterate people and educated people, between wealthy and not wealthy. It's the cell phone. And cell phone revolution has done more for the country than any other infrastructure probably has done over centuries. That cell phone is now followed by smartphones. With Digital India initiative, you will have now a complete universal broadband access. It's a matter of time, within 2-3 years probably, definitely within a decade from now, it'll be a reality. And as cell phone has created enormous revolution in the country, so will in fact the smartphone revolution to a much greater magnitude. So where will India be in 2025? First, it'll be the largest or the second largest consumer market in the world. There are situations where China may be number one as a consumer market, but India will be right there number two, and definitely bigger than the US consumer market. Indian economy, like the Chinese economy and the American economy, and unlike the European economy, is more consumer-driven economy than, let's say, infrastructure-driven economy or industrial-driven economy. As it is transitioning from the agriculture, it has become much more a household or a consumer-based economy, especially in services, and now it is beginning to see the impact on the products, especially branded products, especially luxury products, especially consumer electronics, anything that you can think about. This will be very key growth engine for Indian economy. There are people like the Boston Consulting Group who have done an economic study to show that by 2020, 5 years from now, India will be about $6.5 trillion consumer economy. I'm sorry, China will be $6.5 trillion consumer economy. India will be $3.5 trillion economy. Combined together, $10 trillion economy only in these two markets. based on what is called purchasing power parity, which means it's not how much you earn, but what is your buying power equalized on a worldwide basis through a market basket of goods. My own view is that India is underestimated. It is not 3.5 trillion, but it may be close to 5 trillion, because India has so much of cash economy, and therefore so much of accounting of the economic transactions just is not showing up in any data, especially in the housing market, especially in some of the unorganized sectors. India has a much larger unorganized sector than China has probably now, and definitely the United States. So India may be underestimated, which I think is very key. People don't realize that India's real strength is with its rural people. While we may have treated rural population as a liability, one can take an alternate perspective. I did a research analysis looking at the gold acquisition from 1950 to year 2000, and I was very surprised to see that India had imported, it has no real gold mines, imported about 1,000 metric tons of gold annually, roughly. The data are given by London Metal Exchange. The gateway for importing gold, legal or illegal, would be Dubai, for example, and there may be other gateways. So when you analyze where is that gold, 50,000 metric tons, multiply with 2,000 pounds for a metric ton, multiply with 16 ounces per pound, multiply with $1,500 of value of that gold, you are talking about $2 to $2.5 trillion wealth accumulated. Somebody possesses that wealth. My analysis shows that about 25% is made into jewelry for export markets. So gold has been exported out after doing a value add. The rest 75% actually is with people who we label as base of the pyramid, bottom of the pyramid, the poor people, based upon United Nations definition of $2 per income or less. But they are wealthy. In fact, this is the best way they save money, not in bank accounts, not in the traditional ways we think about savings. This is the oldest saving mechanism worldwide. In fact, a woman in the village, after she gets married, first thing she would like to have is a better sari, different sari, so she can go to the temple dressed better at festivals as well as marriages. And the other thing she would like is gold as a savings mechanism to pass on to the next generation, to the daughters, as a part of wealth succession planning. It's a historical thing. And it's mind-boggling to see that wealth has not been realized in terms of some sort of a borrowing power, for example, which now the government is trying to reform. Second place these poor people invest or save is in India Post. Third place they save because postal system used to be the oldest saving mechanism in the world. In fact, in my analysis I find that the largest banking institution in the world with $3 trillion of asset is Japan Post, because in Japan, like in all the ex-British colonies or British Empire, postal system was the saving mechanism because it had the deepest distribution reach. And everybody saved at the post office because it was guaranteed essentially safety mechanism for their retirement. There was no pension plan, there was no social security as we call it. And so it is $3 trillion of assets. Japan Post has it, for example. So India Post as a savings mechanism, Life Insurance Corporation, LIC, as a savings mechanism, we never really have understood that side, so many of these poor may not be that poor. Second, they own land, and have you seen the land, the prices skyrocket now. Not in the cities, but out in the suburbs. If you go to my native place, Kutch, Gujarat, I could never imagine buying any land at about 15,000 rupees per acre. In fact, I was asked to buy, and I said, who would buy this land? Today you are commanding 45 to 50 lakhs per acre. It is as expensive a real estate as a large metro city like Bombay. Unthinkable. Who owns that wealth? Either you have some aggregators who will do it, but ultimately they are having that money in their pocket. And the third and the biggest change taking place is more surprising to all of us, namely that a crane operator with high school education only, maybe 10, not even a 10 plus 2 as we call it in India, commands today 55 to 60,000 rupees per month salary, same as a fresh software engineer in Bangalore. Except software engineer in Bangalore has no cash flow. He has so much of expense in rent. He grew up as a college student, therefore he has to have an evening life, a lifestyle, wants to buy expensive products, wants to live independently. All of that costs money, so the discretionary income is no longer with the educated metropolitan middle or upper middle class. It is with that crane operator. The crane operator lives with his parents. He is married. Wife is a good homemaker, like the old traditional days. There are no real expenses. They have a huge savings mechanism, and he does not know where to park that money or where to invest that money for the future. It can be unlocked in terms of its potential for the national economy. Probably he is thinking, I need to invest in my children's education, because all parents have the desire that the children will be more and better educated than they are. It may be that I would take care of my aging parents. I would like to buy a better home. Think about the Keralites who go to Dubai and the Gulf countries, and when they come back, go back to their village, buy a piece of land and build their own property. That's wealth creation mechanism. It has economic value. It's not perishable. We have never understood the wealth of the poor because we have a different perspective. That may be a strong foundation for the future of India if we know how to unlock that potential. My second major forecast is that India by 2025 will have Indian enterprises among the top 2 or 3 enterprises in the world, especially in basic industries such as steel, aluminum, copper, cement, etc. And the reason is that most of the advanced countries would like to exit those industries. What I call the vacating theory, essentially. Japan has consistently given up some industries to focus its limited resources into newer industries, which benefited Korea for a while, eventually China for a while, and therefore there are many, many industries in advanced countries which they would like to exit and go into the newer areas, and therefore those assets will be up for sale, and most of them will be bought by Indian enterprises along with maybe Chinese enterprises. This is another key change. India politically will learn how to partner with strange bedfellows in search of industrial raw materials and especially energy resources. India's needs for energy is so vast, and therefore it needs to find a secure supply function. So there would be in Kazakhstan, for example, there may be in Angola, for example, in Iran, in Latin America, Central America, wherever. So there's a race for resources between China and India, and they will basically have mostly a political alignment which we have never understood. Nice part about it is that India has a strong soft power. For whatever reason, India's legacy has been positive, and generally people believe that doing business with India is quite useful. It has talented writers, it has supplied teachers all over the world, professors, research scientists, and therefore all of that comes into the play about having these strange bedfellows between India and the rest of the world, mostly strange bedfellows, South country, which is India, emerging economy with other South countries, not just advanced countries. India will also gain significant geopolitical power, and people of Indian origin will be invited to lead many of the world organizations and forums, such as United Nations agencies, for example, such as the IMF, for example, such as the World Bank. These are very key initiatives where India will be able to go further up. Why would all this happen? What are its advantages? My view is that India is resource rich, and we need to analyze and understand and therefore unlock its potential by making those resources work for the nation as much as they work for the individuals who own or possess those resources. The first key resource is its human capital. With a large number of well-educated young people, it will be the largest, youngest educated workforce in the world. And the world will need that workforce either in India or any place else, because most of the advanced countries are aging and aging fast. They cannot have their own young people anymore working, and India may become a target, especially in professional services such as software, such as accounting, such as legal services. We can already see that thing. Or more interestingly, people will come to India because that's where the resource or the raw material is, as they came to India in the 1800s because cotton was here, so they put the textile mills. Iron and steel, or iron and coal were here, and therefore they put the steel mills, for example. The British outsourcing under David Ricardo's thinking, which led to the outsourcing of two key industries in the United States and in India, which is why India is good in textiles and garments. After more than 100 years, it is good in steel, for example. So human capital is its biggest asset, and we have still not learned how to unlock its potential. As I have said in other forums, if you take a grain of wheat and make it into a loaf of bread, the value add is only 3 times. If you take a rough diamond and cut it, polish, a good diamond cutter will probably increase the value add 15 to 20 times. But if you take a human being, polish, mentor, educate, invest, the value add is infinite. And that value add is very right in the sense that it is a value add not only for the nation, but it's a value add for the individual. What is good for the individual is also good for the nation. So focusing on human capital resource advantage, I think, is very key, however we do it. Indian diaspora over the last 30-35 years is incredibly large and worldwide. Not only that, but the Indian diaspora, unlike the Italian diaspora or the Mexican or the Hispanic diaspora or other diaspora, is very well educated and very well integrated into those countries where they have settled. It is not same as the early days of settlement in Africa, East Africa, where the merchant community went and became business people. These are all educated scientists, professors, writers, authors. You're talking about an intellectual class who now is getting mainstream into politics of those nations, whether it's United Kingdom or United States. They're getting integrated, and the integration of them into the mainstream economy, politics, the life, is becoming very interesting. There are no Indian ghettos as we know. As there are early immigrants from Europe that came to America, Indians are actually living in every neighborhood, which is again very fascinating. They have brought their own culture like everybody else, and their culture is getting now integrated and assimilated with their other cultures. So in England, for example, the most convenient food is no longer fish and chips. It is Indian curry, chicken tandoori especially, for example. Fascinating. This is a very different impact. Whereas an immigrant, otherwise you become more the nation that you adopted as your second home. But in this case, Indians are actually changing the nation in which they have gone as their second home, which I think is remarkable. So they have a political clout, they have a wealth clout, the Indian in hotel motel businesses, hospitality industry in the US have done very, very well. Multi-billion dollars of assets and the wealth are created. As Indians have done very well in the Silicon Valley, that we know quite a lot, getting into the digital world and the technologies. Indian diaspora needs to be leveraged properly. Third, India is also blessed with natural resources, agriculture, industrial, animal. It's the largest cattle in the world, and it is the largest milk producer and milk consumer in the world for a long shot. I mean, nobody can come near them. So it has another resource advantage. Natural resources, human capital resources, diaspora resources, and it's a question of how do you leverage, how do you capitalize. Surprisingly, India also has what I call a functional diversity. It is more diverse than European Union in any dimension. Languages, faiths, religions, any way you look at it. And it is governed by a functional democracy that provides a continuity despite diversity. If anything else, India is a role model for Europeans to learn, because in India today, maybe probably Mahatma Gandhi's freedom movement, we all forgot our own subcultures. I'm a Gujarati, I'm a Tamilian, I'm a UP, I'm a Bengali, and we began to say, I'm Indian first, Gujarati second, Indian first, Bengali second, Indian first, Tamilian second. I can see that happening in Europe. Germans will be Germans always first and Europe second. French will be French first and Europe second. Italians will be Italian first. I don't see them thinking like I'm European first and then a German second. So there is some way we have somehow united ourselves. Whether it's our democratic process of elections, whether it's our judicial system, whether it's our financial system, whether it's our private enterprise system, I don't understand, whatever it is, but there is this unification. So when I meet some other Indian, I can say, I'm Indian, he's Indian, rather than saying I'm a Gujarati and you are a Bengali. That comes as a second thought. I think it's a major strength, unified identity in a diversity. Despite all of the other things we talk about as secular issues, and all the stuff, I think India is a lot more capable of, in fact, handling unification under diversity. Last one, and the very key one, I think, is entrepreneurship. It's in the DNA of the culture. And I have a view that the real competitive advantage of a nation is not capitalism, it is entrepreneurship. The two are not the same, please. Entrepreneurship is more universal. It does not recognize literacy. Most illiterate people are entrepreneurs, as most literate people are entrepreneurs. It does not recognize gender. Women are entrepreneurs, men are entrepreneurs. In fact, if anything else, in the lower socioeconomic classes, women have proven to be better entrepreneurs. Does not recognize age. You can be an entrepreneur in your late 80s and you can be an entrepreneur at a young age. Does not recognize ethnic diversity, religious diversity, anything. And to me, if there is one resource where China is unable to compete, is entrepreneurship. While Chinese were entrepreneurial, but the imposition of the communist rule, just like in Russia and the Soviet Union, suppressed the entrepreneurship to a level where they think of working for the government first rather than being self-employed, creating wealth and value for themselves and for the nation. So in many ways, the real competitive advantage of the nation is the entrepreneurship DNA the nation has. So it looks like a very rosy picture, which it is. And I'm a firm believer in that, actually. Not because I'm passionate about the nation, but an objective analysis says that it has potential to become one of the largest super economic powers if it wants to be. So what's holding back? What's holding back is the legacy since independence. It's shackled by earlier processes, bureaucracies, procedures, values, mindset. how do we unlock, and what are those barriers that are coming in the way? The first major barrier in my view is that Indian economy, even though it's very large as a consumer economy, is highly fragmented. Under the license Raj, you didn't allow production to be controlled by any one company. Also, in fact, we have more family-run businesses, even though they may not have economies of scale. For succession planning in the family, you basically allow to remain suboptimal. So the scale advantage a nation generally has, which allows then much greater modernization, automation, just doesn't come about. I think it's one of the biggest weaknesses in India, and the natural evolutionary process will not allow industry consolidation to make them more efficient. In capitalistic countries, the natural process of shakeout and mergers as the industry grows makes them more efficient. So my view is that in India, it has to be a government policy and incentive. We just have too many banks, for example. We used to have too many cement companies. We probably have too many channels, video channels, cable channels, for example. Rationalization by its own force will not happen because of the other issues. And therefore, how do you encourage consolidation, rationalization by a policy is very critical. The second biggest disadvantage is the unorganized sector. Even today, in many, many industries, unorganized sector is the biggest sector. Problem with unorganized sector is that it does not have the scale efficiency. Not only that, but because it has workers who don't have all the rights, because it has in fact non-tax paying mechanisms, it's a caste-driven economy, it makes the nation as inefficient as one would think. So to me, converting the unorganized sector into organized sector is probably a key strategic initiative. It is happening by natural process, where the next generation of new middle class consumers who want to buy branded products are demanding branded products, and some of the unorganized sector providers are shifting, but majority probably would not survive in the process. So some sort of a rationalization of the unorganized sector into organized sector becomes very key. Third, as everybody has talked about, it needs modern infrastructure. Physical infrastructure of airports, seaports, railways, roads, etc. But it also needs a modern legal infrastructure, modern financial infrastructure. It is still coming on the way, it's not there yet, in my view, and therefore it needs all other infrastructures to kickstart the economy into the industrial age. In fact, it really needs more and more digital universality as much as possible, which is another major infrastructure. So modern infrastructure displacing the old infrastructure is probably the reason why all major nations that have transitioned from agricultural to industrial economy have been able to invest. And my view is that that investment in modern infrastructure is non-inflationary and probably will kick in about 1.5% additional GDP growth annually, which is a great advantage for the nation. It needs to do value-added manufacturing. Make in India initiative is in that direction. Think about what happened in China. It was not for the Chinese market, please. Many foreign companies began to make their branded products in China because of the labor advantage, and the Chinese government allowed. So you import raw materials, you do the value add through labor primarily, but you also had technical skills given. You had given mechanization, automation, whatever was necessary. So skill development evolved not by Chinese corporations, but by foreign corporations wanting to do value add there and bring those branded products back to their home countries. US led the way with the political alignment between China and India under Deng Xiaoping. President Carter as a dialogue began under Nixon administration, and the rest is history. China became the largest outsourcing nation in manufacturing in the world. Interestingly, there are, by the way, 3 nations which are largest sourcing destinations. US is one of the largest ones, but US raw materials are usually utilized for its own domestic production and value add for domestic consumption. India is also a very large sourcing nation, but again large percentages for domestic consumption and domestic value add. How can we make India as a value add for the world and become an alternative to China? World will de-risk from so much of sole dependence on China. It needs a second option to diversify its sourcing mechanism across industries, from agricultural raw materials to industrial raw materials to finished products or whatever they are. And India is that make in India, I think, is a lot more strategic. My own view is that in India, unlike China, which began at the low end of products like toys and cheap products in some fashion, India probably can do much better at the high end products, semiconductors, softwares. Defense is a very key economic growth engine for India. So offset business, as we call it, etc., becomes very, very value add manufacturing. And India has the talent and the resources to do it. One major problem with India is lack of discipline or lack of enforcement. We do have this view about chalta hai, as opposed to having a sense of urgency. My biggest worry is that we have to have a sense of urgency not only in the government leaders, but also in the average citizen. We will miss the boat otherwise, because just as China and India have risen, the next major continent to rise is Africa, and Africa is not going to wait for anybody. Just like China, Africa will be made by non-Africans. It is the largest continent with more resources, unimagined size. Just like America was discovered, was a big continent, whole Western Hemisphere with resources, no population, no infrastructure, no education, no manufacturing. It was basically natives living there into tribes. But it was discovered as a great nation for resources. Africa is a lot more advanced today. It has almost 1 billion population who is all into branded products and consuming that. Africa can unite properly, and I would not wait, therefore, the rise of Africa taking over India. So India has to have a sense of urgency. What can we do in the next 5 to 10 years so that we do not get squeezed? China will not get squeezed, I know, and therefore how do we do it before the rise of Africa? So lack of discipline, lack of urgency is what I believe is very important. We have low investment in skill development. We have either people who are only high school, 10 years college, high school education, or 10+2 at best, or people who go to brainy colleges, they become engineers. They're much more cerebral, but not how to do it, not hands-on. And nations that have invested in vocational technical training have made enormous changes, starting with Germany, of course, America the same way, but more recently has been South Korea. In less than 35 years, South Korea, by investing in vocational technical training, becoming the manufacturing for America and the rest of the world, has become very advanced nation. And you can see the contrast between North Korea and South Korea very clearly in the process. South Korea invested in vocational technical education for offshore manufacturing or manufacturing for foreigners, and I think it's very important. Unfortunately, India is still having the legacy of government acting as a gatekeeper. You need approval, everything from the government, for everything you do in your life, which was the foundation of the nation, the socialistic pattern of society, not trusting the business as a institution, lack of trust. Business is more exploitative of the masses, etc. While it may be the right theory at that time, it does not seem to be the theory for the future. So how can government become from a naysayer, a gatekeeper, to a government that says, how can I enable you, how can I encourage you, is very key. And the last one is that unfortunately India, like in education, vocational technical, has not invested in public health. We have very poor public health, especially sanitation. But it is not limited to sanitation. It is about disease spread. It is about environmental issues. So public health is another major weakness in India that we need to overcome essentially. So what can we do? My view is that call to action means we need a sense of urgency. As I mentioned, the rise of Africa is here and inevitable. Second thing, and this is very important for us as Indians to realize, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for the country. Remember John F. Kennedy made that a strong statement when he became the President of the United States. I think we are in the same situation. As Indians, we are very good about self-interest. And of course, collective self-interest does not make public interest. I don't buy that argument about Adam Smith of capitalism. My view is that it has to be steered in the right direction. And therefore, we have to ask ourselves, in whatever I do in my life, how am I contributing not only toward me and my family, but toward the nation? How can I contribute back to the nation for all the things it has invested in me, in my education, in my upbringing, whatever it is? Third, private-public partnership is inevitable in infrastructure investments. Infrastructure needs are so massive, and of course we have two new organizations, the BRICS Bank as it is called, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, creating their own bank, counterpart in fact to IMF and World Bank, and having this Asia Infrastructure Development Bank. These are very key initiatives, and I think leveraging that would be very key in terms of moving India to the forefront by 2025. Refocus on manufacturing, especially high-valued manufacturing that I talked about, and I think Make in India strategy can steer that in the right direction. Embracing inclusive growth. We all talk about inclusive growth, and we have the economic development theories, but my view is that inclusive growth is not just creating livelihood for the masses and base of the pyramid, but creating wealth for them. This debate of wealth versus income is absolutely futile. This duality we create is unnecessary. It is like quality versus cost. Well, you have to have better quality at a lower cost. Same thing, you not only have best income, but best wealth creation mechanism. How do we democratize wealth is very important in any kind of an inclusive growth strategy. Strong message, computerize, 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 the government and the governance. There is no way to reduce corruption or eliminate corruption except through computerization. So to me, computerization is probably one of the biggest investments, and fortunately, with the modern cloud computing technologies, the wireless technologies, the cost of computerization is at least 100 times cheaper than in the 80s, for example, maybe almost 1,000 times cheaper than the legacy mainframe computer systems, which I remember fondly when I used to work in that area. I also believe that we need a strong enforcement against those who corrupt. Corruption is a two-way, it's a tango. There is a recipient and there is a giver. We focus so much on the recipient, the person who gets corrupted, but we have not focused on people who corrupt them to get unfair competitive advantage. And I think not only do we have to have laws, which we have, but the enforcement of the laws is very key. And my view is that the political process in a democracy needs funding. Make the funding transparent. There is nothing wrong in revising the laws about campaign monies, or one can literally get large sums of campaign money from the masses if they believe in you as a candidate rather than from a handful of wealthy families or businesses. As Obama clearly showed in America, He did not need the large corporate funding in 2008 elections. It was basically crowdfunding by the masses who believed in what he wanted to do for the nation. As it was shown under the last election, where the BJP and Prime Minister Modi had a crowdfunding quite a lot. So small people can contribute small money, and that small money, when you collectively put together, is much bigger. So you really don't need the traditional process of favoritism, which we need to understand. One more point I wanted to make is that I have analyzed return of investment on corruption. I find ROI of corruption is, first of all, negative quite often. It eventually comes to haunt you. But ROI of corruption is definitely less than ROI of a buffalo. So if you look at the buffalo ROI, or a cattle, milk producing cows in India, like Amul dairy farmer, and look at the value that it creates for the farmer return, a buffalo or a cow, from the time it is born till it dies, contributes enormously to the livelihood, as they have shown in Bangladesh with the microfinancing, the Grameen Bank experiments. It is very much there. So ROI of corruption is far less than the ROI of a buffalo, which says it is not even in the self-interest of the corporations to engage in corruption. Not only it's illegal, immoral, but it's not even economically necessary or viable. And by the way, the downside risk of corruption on the organization is mind-boggling. It is almost like destroying a whole corporation with one bad incident, right? So despite these obstacles, I'm very optimistic about the future of India. And the reason is very simple. India will be made not by India or Indians, but its destiny will be made and delivered by non-Indians. This is because the world, including China, needs India for its human capital as a major strategic resource and for its global growth. Thank you very much.